Hello, welcome to another one of our videos, and today we're going to be looking at osteoporosis and the critical factors you need to know about in order to preserve your bone density. So one thing I'll say about this video, it's not just for old people. A lot of people think it's just for someone who's over 60 or something. A lot of the things that prevent this really can be done in your early 20s, so even from earlier than that. So alright, let's get into it. So firstly, what is osteoporosis? So it's basically a disease of the bone that makes a person's bones weaker and more likely to break. It's often referred to as a silent disease because you don't necessarily feel them getting weaker, you only know about it till something bad happens, like a fracture or postural deviations, and often pain. But usually the problem's beginning well before many people are aware of it. So that's why it's important to do things in your early years so you don't find out till it's too late. So due to the fact it's hard to detect, it's difficult to determine the true number of people who actually have it. So there's a lot of people walking around that don't know they've got it because they don't have any obvious pain or problems yet to tell them to do something about it. So it's often, like I said, a minimal fracture occurs. Other things that might be leading up to that are like facet joints, problems in your lower back. You can notice that your height's decreased, and obviously stooped over postures. They're all signs of problems. But sometimes people think it's an injury or something, when really it's an underlying weakness within their bones. So how prevalent is it? Well, I'll have a look at a closer stats between male and female in a minute, but worldwide, that's quite a lot. 1 in 3 women over the age of 50 and 1 in 5 men over the age of 50 will start to experience some osteoporosis in these stages. So healthy bone, osteoporotic bone, so you can see all the different variations of them. So some people might have only the mild version that's not associated with huge problems yet, and it's when it gets to this one that they start to have abnormal fractures and things like that, but like lower back problems and things like that. So calcium is obviously a big part of it, but it's not the only thing, because you can't just eat yourself to good bones. You have to actually apply resistance to them, which we'll talk about in a minute. So how prevalent, if I'm looking, I'm in Australia, so if I'm looking at Australia, the prevalence among those aged 50 and over was estimated to be 23% for women and 6% for men. So it's quite a fair bit for the women. That has a lot to do with menopause, so the menopause sort of exposes them, but also a lack of muscle mass to begin with. So so females it's really more important than males, but it doesn't mean that men can't get it. That's where a lot of men think that they're immune to it when they're not. If we're looking at like US statistics, it shows that 54 million Americans, half of all adults aged 50 and older, at risk of breaking a bone, should be concerned about their bone health. So again, you can see the effects of like your posture. When the bones soften, you start to stoop over and you lose height. So you may not have any pain yet or any fractures, but these are all warning signs that you're really getting severe osteoporosis. All right, and you need to do something about it because it leads to a lot of problems. So when we're talking about bone density, bones are in a constant state of renewal, so new bone's made and old bone is broken down, and when you're young this happens really quick, and your muscle mass and everything supports it faster, and your metabolism's quicker, everything happens really quickly, so it's not a problem. But as we start to age, especially after our peak bone mass, which is around about 30, the bone loss is bone mass is lost faster than new ones created. So, and this is where the osteoporosis occurs, when the creation of the new bone doesn't keep up with the loss of the old bone, and that's when so if nothing's done about it, it leads to disability and things like that. Very difficult to come back from. So if we look at bigger stats, like with the variation males versus females, you can see like the bone growth, they're both fairly similar in the early years, but the female mass is always a lot different, especially as males, around the ages 20, 30, really peaking quite high and stay fairly good for a long period of time, where the females have a real sudden drop off around about that age of 50, which is around about the menopause sort of kicking in, which explains why the stats are, you know, 3 times more likely to go through it. So, the menopause sort of stops or prevents the body from absorbing the calcium as effectively as they did when they were in the younger years. So, doesn't mean that it's like inevitable. There's many things you can do, which we'll talk about, that will reduce that risk and prevent that sudden drop off, and so you can maintain. And same with the males. Inactivity and poor diet are a real problem for causing this. So when we're talking about cause, there's no single one thing. So some things are out of your control, like the sex you are. So if you're female, you can't change that, right? So your age, you can't change that. Your race, even how big you are. So people who are small body frames tend to have a higher risk because they might have less muscle mass to support the bones when they age. All right, so other things you can't necessarily change are hormonal problems. Some of them you can, but things like the menopause, as we've spoken about, you know, and the fall in estrogen levels, they're all just a part of the hormonal system that is normal, but it just puts things at risk in other systems. So thyroid problems, medications used to treat other diseases, rheumatoid arthritis, IBS, cancer, kidney, liver, it can all weaken bone, leaving you vulnerable to developing this later in life. So it doesn't mean that you just give up and you say, well, I can't do anything about it. It just means you have to really know what they are and really put a bit of effort into changing them. So things you can change and can control are lifestyle factors. So because in many cases, it's a lot of these that tip you over the edge. The hormonal and the other things that you can't change might expose you to risk, but they're not enough on their own. They might need a nudge of your poor lifestyle choices, especially with exercise and nutrition, to really tip the balance out of favour, and then you end up in trouble. All right, so that's a good little quote here: healthy isn't a goal, it's a way of living. So inactivity is a big one. All right, so people who rarely exercise or spend a lot of time sitting have the much higher risk than those who are much more active. So when you consider how many jobs that are very sedentary, like where, say, 50, 60 years ago, 100 years ago especially, we were much more labour intense occupations, so we didn't really need to work out because we were working out all the time. But now jobs are very lazy, and if you don't make an effort to get off the couch, you're really going to increase the risk significantly more. This one really needs no explanation: poor diet and malnutrition. So any diets that are devoid of calcium and the important vitamins and nutrients will expose the bones to weakness and speed up the rate of which it takes place, which is why it's not just an old person's disease. And other destructive habits that you can control: excessive drinking, smoking, and we all know that they're not good for us. But you know, if you're doing this and eating poor food and not exercising, and you're female and you're over the 50, you can see how all of these factors start to accumulate, and they're enough to tip you over the edge. All right, so if you can control a lot of these things, even just small changes can be the difference between strong and weak bones. All right, so what can you do to prevent it, or if you already have it, what can you do to prevent further decline? Well, obviously, first things, eat some quality nutrition. So if you're eating a good variety in your diet, you're likely to have it under control. However, if you eat the same things all the time and you're a bit fussy and restrict the type of variety, and there's a good chance you're missing out on some of the things that you need, especially the important nutrients and vitamins. So people on weight loss diets who very much try to restrict things and cut back their calories may lose weight, but at the expense of their bone health and also other parts of their health. So that's why I'm not a big fan of like those type of things. It's more about the quality of your diet and getting what your body needs to sustain good health than how much you weigh on the scales as such. So when we're specifically talking about calcium and protein, obviously it's a huge disaster for the bones, for calcium and protein for the muscles which support the bones. So in a recent study, they showed postmenopausal women with calcium and energy intakes below the recommended levels had lower bone mineral density than postmenopausal women who had the adequate levels. So, or just from that alone, not taking into account any other factors was enough to sort of show significant difference in bone mineral density. So we know for babies and toddlers and infants when they're growing how important the calcium is for their bones. Well, it's the same thing for older adults, and we tend to take that for granted. So the calcium's not just for the bone; it can help regulate heart rate. And the biggest difference with the older adult versus the children is the older adult doesn't absorb it very well, where the kid absorbs it extremely well, extremely fast. It's a lot harder for an adult to absorb. All right. So this means that as you age, your energy requirements for specific nutrients actually increase. So you may be eating less food because you don't need as much, but the type of quality of the food might be significantly greater than it was before because you're going to need it. So this is something that a lot of people who are on restricted calorie diets are really exposing themselves to bigger problems. Nutrient dense, well absorbed foods, targeted supplementation, they're all necessary things for the older adults. So people over 50 and over should aim to get about 1,200 milligrams of calcium per day. Vitamin D, well, you can have this in a supplement form. You can get it in some foods, but it's not very well absorbed through food. You basically get that from sunlight. So if you're not getting enough sunlight, if you're trying not to get sunlight, well, you're going to be deficient in that. For the body to basically absorb the calcium into the bones, it needs magnesium and vitamin D to be able to deliver that to the area from the digestive system. So really important to have put an emphasis on getting good quality of both those vitamins. What about exercise? Well, in terms of exercise, a lot of people are they're aware that they need to do some strengthening, but there's two mistakes I often see them make. They really don't spend enough time making sure they move well before they just go to strengthening, and secondly, they have a real fear of it doing damage, so they do stupid things like rubber bands that achieve absolutely nothing. Don't get me wrong, resistance bands are useful, I use them all the time, but they're nowhere near enough for what the body needs, which I'll explain in a minute. So firstly, if we talk about the first mistake is the ignorance to moving well. So it's where people have heard they need to exercise and they do strength training, it'll help the bones. So they think, okay, let's just go out and do the hardest stuff as possible, or let's copy someone else's program, not really determining if it's safe for them to do so. So they just think, well, as soon as I get started, it'll all just fix itself. The body never just fixes itself. If you move badly at the start, it'll only get worse once you increase both frequency and in volume and intensity. All right, so if you do any of those things, you're like what was already a problem is now going to be a huge problem. So now instead of just having osteoporosis, you've probably got a bulging disc or a blown out knee or a shoulder impingement or something like that. All right, so it's really important to make sure you know how to move well before you start applying. Even cardio, so going for runs and that, you need to make sure that you run efficiently to be able to handle the stress that you're going to put on your body. So a lot of people can't be bothered because it takes too long to learn how to do it. They just want to get to the fun stuff. So their impatience and their ignorance really sets them up for big problems. And you really need to earn the right to use heavy loads that produce the big strength gains that will help the bones. The shortcut is to do machine training, which kind of speeds it up a bit, but again, it's very ignorant to moving well and usually sets you up for joint and stability problems. So you might get significant strength gains in the beginning, but it sets you up for problems because you still don't know how to move well. So this quote here, don't add strength to dysfunction, move well first, then move often. Okay, so here's a good quote for you. So whenever possible, we must separate movement dysfunction from fitness and performance. Aggressive physical training cannot change fundamental mobility and stability problems at an effective rate without also introducing a degree of compensation and increased risk of injury. So the second mistake is, you do need resistance. So avoidance of using loads. So treating old people like that that it's too risky to use loads and it's unsafe. I think it's the other way around. It's unsafe not to show them loads. If they can stand up like this, why the hell are they doing bullshit like this with their legs crossed? This is just absolute rubbish. All right, so if they're good enough to be able to stand and do things, make them do things standing up and teach them how to do it. The ignorance of not showing them is more dangerous than what you will give them. And this quote is a great one. If you think lifting weights is dangerous, well, try being weak. Weak is even more dangerous. All right, so bones, for them, in order to be to grow and to strengthen, they must be exposed to resistance, and rubber bands just don't cut it. Most people, they think that what they are doing is good enough, or that working out anymore is dangerous. But like I've said several times, the bones actually need that challenge. They'll only change in order of the challenge given to them. So if anything, they need more challenge than the younger people. So this is where yoga and walking, and like, they're great forms of exercise, don't get me wrong, and they're great. I'm not saying don't do them. They're just not enough. So you should be efficient at walking. It's great for the cardiovascular system. It does improve some strength to some degree, but not enough. It doesn't really do anything for the upper body. All right, so you really need to spend more time on working out strength training that forces the bone to grow. So to force them to grow, it needs a stress greater than normal placed upon it. So this graph is a real good one. So sitting on a chair that is below normal stress. All right, so it's not conducive to bone growth. Walking is a little bit better, but it's still not large enough to create any bone growth. It's only when you start to get to resistance with loads that you start to force the body into changing something. Now, if you go too far and you do more than you can handle, then you create excessive stress and you create a bone fracture. So the sweet spot is round about here. So and that's where you need to have exercises that target specific areas, and you need to ensure that you move well, so you do them so you don't break anything. So the three factors for the bone strength, so these are really that help the bone to grow, are really bone density, bone quality, and bone geometry. So it's really playing with angles and variety and difference in intensity that forces that to happen. All right, so the dynamic movements work really well because your body moves in a way that forces you to use all of these three factors simultaneously. So this is due to the fluid flow around the bone that places a large strain on the bone itself that forces it to respond by improving its overall structure. So this means that multidirectional exercises with load improve it faster due to they incorporate so many of these structural lines. So forcing challenges with these exercises with either load or speed creates a structural change. It's one reason why machine training does very little, because there's no multi-directional angles and variety to it that encompasses, which, as you can see in these exercises, step up, cable pushing, these angles can be manipulated quite easily. Even deadlifts and that can be done with 2 legs and single leg and variations. And these are all older adults that work out in our gym here at the moment, and they're all in their 70s and 80s. All right, so when you know how to move well, it's really easy to make the bone stronger, and then it's easier to make the bones adapt much faster without excessive amounts of volume. So it's the beauty of the strength training, especially with free weights and cables. It's really easy to manipulate these angles and dynamic versions so that you can create more change from the least amount of training. So this brings to the next point: how often should you train? Well, optimal training frequency, for most people, maybe 3 workouts a week. Where there's a point where your training comes in, you're fatigued, you need recovery, and then there's an adaptation time where you're resting, and then you come back and you do it again. All right. So if you're training very lightly, there's very short recovery time, but you're not really achieving much. If you train really hard, you're achieving quite a lot, but the recovery time's a lot longer. So you're trying to find the sweet spot, and that is the trick. It's really easy to overtrain, which I've videos about this before. So this would be an ideal response where you're gradually improving. This would be like overtraining. This would be not training enough. So A is the optimal one. This one's just not enough recovery time. You're always coming back too quickly. But in terms of adults, it's a little bit different. So they've found out it's probably better to work out more often instead of one massive workout. So for example, to use it, the study where they did skipping, when they got people to do 120 jumps per day, showed a 50% improvement overall bone structure by splitting the jumps into 2 sets of 60 sessions. So they do 60 in the morning, 6 at night. Was better than 120 in one go. And the reason that they determined for this is the bone growth responds better to smaller, more frequent bouts of stimulus instead of less frequent and high volume. So, so if the goal is to reduce exercise time, it's better to shorten each exercise session than to reduce the overall number of sessions performed. This might be where you use split workouts, where you're doing upper body one day, legs the next day, so on. So you could sort of shorten it. So it might, instead of working out an hour, it might be 2 half-hour sessions. This is, again, like I put here, you could probably do a strength day on a Monday and a Friday that consists of big lifts, and then you got lighter workouts that might include agility exercises like this, or skipping like we just saw, and sort of small jumping exercises that create a different type of bone strength. So trying to mix it up a bit, working on balance and things like that as well, they're all important. The thing is, you just really need to have a good variety. You can't just do the same thing over and over. Alright, so in summary, with almost every disease, it's always easier to prevent things than to try and fix it after it's affected you. So obviously nutrition is important. Get the optimal levels of calcium, protein, magnesium, vitamin D. Don't fall into the trap of thinking you can just eat yourself to strong bones. You can't do that. You have to exercise. The walking and light activities will not cut it. Resistance is important, but make sure you learn how to move well. Strength training is by far the best way to prevent the bone loss. The exercise will benefit your bones no matter when you start, but the sooner you start, the better, because it will help you for the rest of your life. That's why I was saying this isn't just an old person's video. Alright, so I hope you've enjoyed, got some information from this that gives you some help. There's heaps of reports that I have about these type of things that you can check out in the link below, in the description below the video. Alright, I hope you enjoy that, and see you next time.